on the other end of the simulation to control a billion or a trillion things at once. And for us, it's the same thing as controlling one thing.
Right, but what would that be at that point? It would basically be another AI, probably, right? Or
Might be, yeah.
Yeah, and so
where does I had mentioned this earlier, but a book that really just blew my mind and changed how I looked at things was Superintelligence by Bostrom, where effectively that was one of the hardest books I ever read, in the sense that it wasn't enjoyable and it wasn't meant to be enjoyable. It was like, he's a genius. I'd love to talk with that guy sometime, but he essentially laid out every possible that he could conceive of extrapolation of, let's say, like the decision trees of the directions that AI could go effectively.
Yep.
And obviously he worked in some other concepts as well. But like, where does AI marry into like the multiverse? Or are these two separate things that happen to exist on a similar playing field, or are they tied to the same person or entity holding the strings up here?
Well, you can look at it a few different ways. So I got interested in Bostrom because he wrote a paper, even before his book Superintelligence, he wrote a paper in 2003 called Are You Living in a Computer Simulation?
Yeah.
And so he pretty much invented what's called the modern simulation argument. And that argument is actually about AI, it turns out. And so when I mentioned the NPC versus RPG versions of the simulation hypothesis, there's the Matrix version. There's a guy named David Chalmers, who's also a philosopher. Nick Bostrom is also a philosopher. So philosophers clearly like to think about this stuff more than the rest of us. And Chalmers coined the term the Matrix hypothesis back in 2003. And when I was talking to him, he said, well, everybody ended up using the simulation hypothesis, which Bostrom coined first. But his basic idea was that if a technological civilization could get to a certain point, and that point was where they could create AI versions of conscious beings. And you could create millions of those beings, billions of those beings, inside a simulation.
That aren't technically conscious.
Depends on how you define consciousness, but basically he was saying if you add up all the amount of neurons and the amount of information a person has in their entire life, and he was kind of estimating, maybe you could have a big computer. He wasn't even getting quantum computing, right? This was back in 2003. So he was just estimating that if you can have these AI beings, well, then you can have a billion or trillion of them in one simulation very easily, and you can fire up another simulation. What do you need? More server space, right? And with Moore's law, which we mentioned earlier, continues to hold, you're going to get better and better computational process. Cost of compute keeps coming down as well, but also the amount of computation you can do keeps coming down. And I think at the time, Bostrom estimated something like an advanced civilization might take a whole planet and use all the mass of that planet for computation. And they could create lots of simulations. In fact, they could create millions of simulations. And each of those simulations could have basically billions of simulated beings inside them. And so his point was that if any civilization ever got to that point, that they could create all these AI beings and all these civilizations, and these simulated civilizations, then he said, if you are a being and you can't tell the difference whether you're simulated or not, which are you more likely to be in? There's one base reality, let's say X number of beings. There's a billion simulations, each with billions of beings. There's a hell of a lot more of these AI simulated beings than there are people in the base reality.
Right, because they were extrapolated upon. Okay.
Extrapolated. Or the simplified version, and there's a clip of Elon Musk in 2016, actually, the same year that I was playing ping pong, where he talks about this too. He said, basically, if there's one base reality and there's a billion simulated worlds, then the chances that you're in base reality is 1 in billions.
Right.
Which means if you flip it around, what are the chances that you're in a simulation?
Very high.
Very high, right? A billion minus 1.
I think about this
right?
often. Yeah.
Yeah. So from that perspective, this is where Bostrom's AI work and simulation theory intersect, right? Because, and most people don't realize that he was talking about the NPC version, not the Matrix version.
Oh, like you were explaining earlier.
Yeah. Because his logic was built primarily on the number of simulated beings. Well, you can't be playing that many simulated beings necessarily. They would have to be AI. Right. So they would have to be like running in a simulation all
On
by
their
themselves.
own without you controlling.
Without you controlling them, because in base reality, you couldn't really control unless you had AI doing it for you, in which case it's the same
That's what
thing.
I'm saying. Like, are there things that we can't even conceive here that could possibly make that, like, have a godlike ability on the other end of the simulation to control a billion or a trillion things at once? And for us, it's the same thing as controlling one thing.
Right, but what would that be at that point? It would basically be another AI, probably, right? Or
It might be, yeah.
Yeah, and so I think one of the reasons why I'm interested in simulation theory is because it opens up other possibilities, and so even Bostrom, kind of talks about this. He said that people who are staunch atheists, once they consider simulation theory, they'll say, well, any being that's outside the simulation would appear supernatural to us, right? Maybe they can control 1 million people. Maybe they can have their avatar walk on water, right? There's all kinds of things that could come up that you start to think about differently when you think of an actual simulated reality. And I think that's very interesting because it opens up possibilities that otherwise aren't there in a purely materialistic world, which ties back to, this idea of, did these miracles actually happen, right? Are there people who can be in more than one place, can be at two places at once? That could happen in a simulation, right? I can have my avatar potentially, if the code allows it, in two different places, but it may be a skill or a level. You may have to be at a level in order to be able to do those types of things.
And that also gets weird when you start putting into terminology like that, because that's all you can do, because we only know what happens here and what we know as humans on this, whatever it is, planet or existence of the simulation. But when we talk about like levels and stuff and use like video game terms, who's to say that that's even how they whoever they are determine it? Because they may have an entirely different set of principles as to how. This is getting a little weird how I asked this, but like. You understand what I'm saying? Like they have a different set of principles as how they measure anything.
That's true. And that's what, for us, I'm doing the same thing that, say, the religions did 2,000 years ago. I'm using the latest techno-scientific metaphors, the latest technology, in order to explain something that could be very complicated and could be even more complicated than we can even imagine. Right?
Jesus Virk has a good ring to it.
Well, I was at this Islamic conference and they were talking about ensoulment. When does ensoulment occur? The same debate we have here about abortion, right? When does the soul go into the fetus? Right. Is it at conception? Is it at birth? Is it somewhere in between? Right. Last trimester. And I said, well, I'd like to give a different analogy for what ensoulment means, which is basically it's the time when you put on the headset that you forget about what happens outside. You forget. So many ancient traditions, not just the religions we have today, but many ancient traditions actually describe this process of forgetfulness. Right? This is something that happens when we incarnate. In the Greek traditions, they say that the soul crosses Lethe, the river of forgetfulness.
River Styx is Rome, right?
Yeah, no, it's Greek as well, but it's one of the rivers that you have in the underworld. Styx is the one you cross to go back, but Lethe is the forgetfulness one. Got it. And in the Chinese traditions, you have Meng Po, who's the goddess of forgetfulness, and she brews this tea of forgetfulness. And you drink it, when you die to like forget about everything, but also when you're born as well. And then I mentioned Maya earlier, right, with the story we told.
Illusion. Yeah.
Illusion, but also it's kind of like voluntarily forgetting, right? Agreeing to forget what's in the outside world. And so we've got this thing that happens where we become attached to our body, our character, our avatar. I mean, the word avatar itself, by the way, comes from ancient Sanskrit.
It does?
Yeah. So the guys...
James Cameron didn't tell me that. Damn it.
He didn't tell you that, right?
No.
So a lot of the technology around movies and video games and goes, CGI goes back to Lucasfilm and George Lucas and Star Wars. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So at Lucasfilm, they built one of the first MMORPGs. I wouldn't call it MMO. It wasn't really massively multiplayer, but it was definitely a multiplayer online role-playing game called Habitat. And this was back in like the 80s that they came out with this. And you had these 2D characters on the screen, and that was they were trying to come up with a word to represent that, to say that this character on the screen represents me, the player. And so what they said, well, the guys who were in charge of building Habitat afterwards, they said this. They said, well, it felt like, by the way, they were using Commodore 64s and were using dial-up lines. So it's pretty amazing. They actually got like a full graphic. It wasn't sophisticated graphics. We could even look at the graphics of Habitat. Like if we bring it up, it's just these 2D graphics.
Type in like Habitat.
Yeah, Habitat,
video game or
Lucasfilm. Yeah,
Okay.
You'll see it.
Yeah, it's amazing. Like when you look at graphics now, even from like '07 to today on like NBA 2K or something,
Right.
and where they're at. Oh my God.
Yeah, they're pretty different.
All
right?
the way back there.
So now we're going back to the late 1980s.
Do you want the second one right there?
Yeah, the second one would show you like the graphics.
Okay.
So, I
Can
mean,
we
it's
blow
not
that
bad
up, Alessi?
What's up?
Can we blow that up by any chance? I mean, for the 1980s, that's not the worst thing I've ever seen.
Yeah, it's actually pretty good. I mean, those are pretty.
That looks better. Honestly, that looks better than some of the Game Boy Color we were using in like '05 or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it was in many ways it was ahead of its time. It didn't quite have the 3D perspective, but they said it felt like it was they were a person who's a big person, like, let's say our human size, where they were squeezing themselves into the phone line. And then they were squeezing themselves into this little 2D character on the screen. And they were looking for a term for that. And in Sanskrit, avatar means a divine entity that's very big. Let's say an infinite divine entity that squeezes itself into a human body. So it's like an incarnation of a divine entity. And so they used that term, to be the term. And then Neil Stephenson came out with a cyberpunk novel called Snow Crash in 1992. And he used the term avatar in there for his definition of the metaverse, which was your character. And that basically popularized it. And so now we all, within the entire video game industry, that term is pretty common.
Very, very widely used.
Yeah.
Even after, like, obviously the movies blew up and everything, but that's something like when Michikaku was in here and was talking about, like, if there were half biological entities that existed on Earth, it could be an avatar of so. And now it gets weird because you're like, so it's half real but half not, but they're still using that term.
Right.
Blows my mind a little bit.
Yeah, and the term is being used a lot now for projections, or like in the movie Avatar, right? He was lying down inside the pod and he was controlling the physical, in this case it was a physical entity of the Na'vi, the blue alien.
Thank you for watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.